The notice had been on the kitchen table for 11 days. Clara had moved it twice, once to clear space for dinner, once to make room for her daughter's homework, and both times she had set it back in the same spot, face down, as though the act of not seeing it might delay what it said. But she knew what it said. She had read it the morning it arrived, standing in her robe with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, her eyes moving over the words with the careful attention of someone hoping to find an error. There was no error. The amount was correct. The deadline was correct. The language was the language of finality, polite in the way that institutions are polite, when they have already made their decision and are merely informing you of it. She was 34 years old, and she had been behind on rent before, but never like this. The 3 months was a different kind of behind. 3 months was the kind that produced notices in official envelopes with return addresses that looked nothing like a person. Her daughter, Sophia, was 9. She did not know about the notice. Clara had made sure of that, keeping her voice level at dinner, keeping the worry out of her face the way her own mother had once kept it out of hers, a skill learned not from books, but from necessity, passed down the way poverty itself was passed down, quietly, without ceremony. The second job she had taken in March was not enough. It had been enough to keep the utilities on and the refrigerator mostly filled, but the gap between what she earned and what she owed had a stubbornness to it that resisted all her calculations. She worked the morning shift at a bakery and the afternoon shift answering phones for a property management company, which had its own particular cruelty given the circumstances. She listened to people describe water damage and broken heaters and landlords who would not return calls, and she filed their complaints with the same careful neutrality she applied to everything. And then she went home to an apartment she might not be living in by the end of the month. It was in this state of quiet, private emergency that her grandfather died. He had been 81 years old and in poor health for the last several years. So his death was not a surprise in the way that some deaths are. It was expected in the way of seasons. Everyone in the family had known it was coming. They had spoken about it in that careful and lowered tone reserved for things that are true and near and uncomfortable to name directly. And then it came, a Tuesday morning in late October, and the family gathered at the house where Arturo Medina had lived alone for the last 12 years, since Clara's grandmother had died, and left him with 4 rooms and the particular silence of a man who has spent most of his life surrounded by the noise of others. The house was small and dense, with the accumulation of a long life. Arturo had not been a man who threw things away. This was a quality the family had discussed often and without particular affection. Her aunts had theories about it. Her uncle Raphael said it was a product of his generation, men who had grown up without much and therefore kept everything. Her cousin Tomas, who was 26 and had opinions about most things, or said it was a coping mechanism, a psychological displacement, and Clara had watched her uncle Raphael's face do something quiet and complicated at that description. Arturo himself had never offered an explanation. He had simply kept things, in the way that some people keep silences, as a matter of private necessity that required no justification to anyone else. The boxes were everywhere. Not hoarder's chaos, not the collapse of function that sometimes came with age and isolation, but a dense, organized accumulation of a man who had lived long and saved methodically. Toolboxes with tools still in their places. Cardboard boxes sealed with masking tape and labeled in his handwriting. Folders of documents that went back decades. Old magazines in stacks on shelves. Our furniture he had repaired and kept long past the point where others would have replaced it. The house smelled of machine oil and old paper and something faintly herbal that Clara had always associated with him, a scent she could not name but would have recognized anywhere. The family spent the first day after the funeral making preliminary decisions about what would happen to the contents. This was a conversation Clara had observed before, at the deaths of other relatives, and it always followed the same pattern. There was an initial period of deference, of people saying that nothing needed to be decided immediately, followed quickly by a practical urgency that had less to do with efficiency and more to do with the fact that grief, unoccupied, became unbearable. People needed to move things. They needed to sort and stack and label. It gave the hand something to do while the mind adjusted. Her Aunt Delia took charge, as she always did. Delia was the eldest of Arturo's 3 surviving children, a woman of 62 who ran her household and everyone near it with the quiet authority of someone who has never seriously questioned her own judgment. She organized the family into teams. She designated the kitchen to one group, the living room to another, the garage to a third. She produced trash bags and cardboard boxes from the back of her car with the preparedness of someone who had anticipated this moment and planned accordingly. Clara was assigned to the back room. It was the smallest room in the house, a space Arturo had used partly as a study and partly as something harder to categorize. There was a desk, old and heavy, its surface covered in papers she did not yet feel ready to disturb. There were shelves of books in 2 languages. There were maps, some framed, some rolled and stored in a wooden tube that leaned against the wall. And in the corner, beneath a workbench, mostly hidden by a length of canvas that had been draped over it with what seemed like deliberate intent, was the Strongbox. Clara saw it the first time when she lifted the canvas to determine what was beneath it. Her initial impression was of weight, even before she had touched it. There was something about its proportions, the way it sat on the floor without any suggestion of being moved easily, that communicated mass. It was roughly the size of a large suitcase, made of what appeared to be iron and dark wood, bound together with metal straps that ran along its edges. Its surface was covered in the gray-brown accumulation of long storage, a skin of dust and rust, and the faint mineral deposit left by years of ambient moisture. There were markings on the lid, shapes she could not immediately read through the grime, and a locking mechanism at the front that was unlike the standard padlock she had expected. She stood looking at it for a moment before calling to her aunt. Delia came and looked, and said what Delia always said when confronted with something she did not immediately understand the purpose of. She said it needed to go. It was taking up space. It was old and rusted, and they could not possibly move it without damaging the floor, and they had enough to deal with without worrying about whatever was inside an old metal box that probably hadn't been opened in 20 years. For she said all of this without crouching, without touching it, without any of the preliminary investigation that Clara thought the situation called for. She delivered her verdict from the doorway and then returned to wherever she had been before. Clara did not argue. She had learned early in her relationship with her Aunt Delia that argument was less efficient than patience. She noted the box's location and went back to sorting through the desk drawers with the methodical care she brought to everything. But she did not stop thinking about it. The conversation about the Strongbox became, over the following 2 days, the kind of small, persistent conflict that emerges in families during the administration of estates. It was not a loud conflict. There were no raised voices, no direct confrontations. Instead, I had surfaced and submerged repeatedly, the way certain objects do when water moves through a space, always returning to the same point. Her Uncle Raphael said the box was likely empty or full of old tools, and that they should have it taken away with the rest of the garage contents. Tomas, who had apparently looked up the type of box online and arrived with an opinion about it, said it was a mid-century industrial strongbox, probably from a commercial setting, possibly containing old paperwork that would be more trouble to deal with than it was worth. He said this with a certainty that Clara found puzzling, given that he had spent approximately 4 minutes in the back room. The dissenting voice, aside from Clara's, came from her cousin Renata, who was Delia's younger daughter and who had always been the person in the family most likely to complicate a consensus. Renata said they should at least try to open it before deciding. She said this twice and was ignored both times. And then she was pulled into a discussion about the furniture in the living room, and the point was not revisited. On the third day, when Delia announced that a removal company would be coming on Saturday to take away the contents designated for disposal, Clara asked quietly if she could keep the Strongbox. The response was not hostile. It was something closer to amusement. Her aunt said she was welcome to it if she could arrange to move it herself, since it was clearly too heavy for the removal men to bother with, and they would charge extra for anything requiring special handling. And her uncle said he hoped she wasn't expecting treasure in there, and laughed at his own joke. Tomas said that, if she was lucky, it might have scrap metal value. Renata, who was standing near the door of the back room eating a piece of fruit, caught Clara's eye and said nothing, which was its own kind of response. Clara arranged for a friend with a truck to come the following morning. They moved the box together, the two of them, with considerable effort, and a wheeled furniture Dolly borrowed from a neighbor. It weighed, according to her friend Marco, who had spent 4 years working for a moving company and knew how to estimate these things, somewhere between 300 and 350 pounds. This was more than Clara had expected. It was more than the box's visible size seemed to justify. She had the box placed in the corner of her living room because there was nowhere else for it. It was too large for the hallway. It would not fit through the door of the second bedroom without removing the door from its hinges, which she wasn't prepared to do. The living room was small, and the box made it smaller. Sophia walked around it the first evening with the particular interest of a 9-year-old who has been presented with something unexplained. She asked what was in it. Clara said she didn't know yet. Sophia said it looked like a pirate chest. Clara said she supposed it did. Sophia touched the metal straps along its side and said the rust felt like scales, and then went to bed, which left Clara alone with the box in the quiet of the apartment. She sat on the couch across from it for a long time that evening without doing anything. The light in the room was the particular yellow of a single lamp, insufficient to its space, and the box sat in shadow at the edge of that light, its surface catching just enough of it to show the texture of its construction. She found herself thinking about her grandfather in a way she had not had space for during the last several days of logistics and decisions. Arturo Medina had been a quiet man. She had always known this about him, had grown up understanding it as one of his defining qualities. The way other people's grandfathers were funny or stern or fond of certain subjects. Arturo was quiet. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he was deliberate in a way that suggested each word had been considered before being offered. She had never known him to be secretive. That was a different thing from being private, and she had always understood the distinction. He did not share his interior life easily, but he had never given her the impression of active concealment. His quietness had felt like temperament rather than strategy. Sitting across from the box now, she found herself revising that understanding slightly. The box was not the possession of a man who kept things casually. It was the possession of a man who kept certain things deliberately, with care and intention, and an awareness that they needed to be kept. She did not open it that night. She was tired in the specific way that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from several days of grief administered alongside obligation. And she understood that her attention was not adequate to whatever the box required. She turned off the lamp and went to bed, and lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the building around her, the pipes, the neighbor's television, the distant engine of a car on the street below, and thought about her grandfather, who had carried his silences with him all the way to the end. The next morning, She called in late to her second job and sat down in front of the box with a flashlight and a set of tools she had borrowed from Marco. This was not impulsive. She had been turning the problem over in her mind all night in the fragmentary way that problems present themselves in the hours before sleep, and she had arrived at a systematic approach. She would examine the exterior first. She would document what she found. She would then attempt to understand the locking mechanism before attempting to open it. And this was the approach she brought to most things that required patience, and she applied it here with the same deliberate care. The exterior told her more than she had expected. The metal straps were wrought iron rather than the sheet steel she might have assumed at a glance. They had been fitted to the wood with a precision that was not characteristic of mass production. She could see this most clearly at the corners, where the straps bent and overlapped in a way that required skill to execute without gaps. The joinery was hand-fitted, she thought, though she wasn't an expert in metalwork, and held this conclusion loosely. What she was more certain of was that the box had been made with deliberate attention to durability. The wood beneath the metal, visible in places where the strapping pulled away slightly from the surface, was dense and dark, some variety of hardwood she couldn't identify, its grain tight and fine, the kind that resisted warping and cracking across decades of ambient change. The markings on the lid were clearer once she applied a cloth dampened with water and worked carefully over the surface. They were not decorative. They were functional, the kind of markings applied to commercial or industrial objects for identification and record-keeping purposes. There were numbers, stamped rather than engraved, and a series of characters that might have been a manufacturer's code or a serial designation. There was also, near the left edge of the lid, something she had not noticed before. A small symbol, not stamped but carved directly into the wood surface in the gap between two of the metal straps. It was precise, too precise for an idle scratch. It showed a shape she could not immediately categorize, something between a compass rose and a seal, its lines worn by time, but still readable if you held the light at the right angle. She photographed it with her phone. She photographed everything, working around the box systematically the way she had learned to document things during the years she had spent managing medical records for a clinic, a job she had left when Sophia was born and had not been able to return to. Thorough documentation was a habit she had never lost. It was the kind of habit that came from understanding that memory was unreliable, and records were the only defense against the erosion of time. The locking mechanism was unlike anything she had seen on a residential strongbox. She had looked up the type of box Tomas had identified online, and the images she found showed mechanisms that were standard and recognizable. What she was looking at was neither. The primary lock was recessed deeply into the face of the box, its keyhole a narrow vertical slot that suggested a key of unusual design. But beside it, half hidden beneath a hinged plate, she only noticed when she pressed against the front face of the box and felt something shift, was a secondary mechanism. The plate moved on a pin hinge, revealing a second lock below it. This one with a circular dial and a series of small notches around its perimeter. The combination of the two mechanisms, the key lock primary and the dial secondary, suggested a security design that went beyond what a simple document storage box would require. She sat back on her heels and studied it for a long time. The weight of the box had been the first anomaly. 350 pounds was not consistent with documents and papers, not even with significant quantities of them. Metal was heavy, and the box's construction accounted for some of that weight, but not all of it. She had been doing the rough arithmetic in her head since Marco had lifted the first corner and exhaled in surprise. Even accounting for the iron straps, the dense hardwood frame, and whatever mechanism lay inside the locking assembly, there was weight unaccounted for. Weight that did not belong to the container. Weight that belonged to the contents. She thought about her grandfather then, not as an abstraction, not as the quiet old man she had visited every few weeks for the last decade, but as a younger person, on a man with a history she had only ever glimpsed at the edges. Arturo Medina had come to this country in the early 1960s from a region of South America she had always known only vaguely. A provincial area, he had said, when she asked as a child, without particular emphasis. He had worked in construction for most of his working life, then in a machine shop, then for a period that was less clearly defined. He had done something else, something he described as independent work, before retiring in his early 70s and becoming the quiet old man with the crowded house. She had never thought to ask more specific questions. Children rarely do, and then adults become busy. And then it is too late, and the person who held the answers is gone, and what remains is a house full of boxes and a strongbox in the corner of a living room that weighs more than it should. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from the bakery and 1 from the property management office. She looked at them, and then put the phone face down on the floor beside her and returned her attention to the box. The notice on the kitchen table was still there. The deadline on the notice was 9 days away. She was aware of all of this, with the peripheral clarity that accompanies focused work, present and acknowledged, but not permitted to intrude. There would be time for the notice. There would be time for the calls. What required her attention right now was the symbol carved into the lid, the weight that did not match the size, and the secondary lock half hidden behind its hinged plate. She leaned forward and pressed her palm flat against the lid of the box. The metal was cool beneath her hand, the surface texture of rust and old dust familiar against her skin. She had the sensation, briefly but distinctly, of pressing against something that pushed back. Not physically, not with force, but with the particular resistance of things that have been kept for a reason, and that hold that reason quietly within them, waiting not for the right moment, but for the right attention. She did not have a key. That was the immediate, practical problem. The primary lock was a specialized mechanism, and whatever key it required had not been among the items recovered from her grandfather's house. Delia had found a ring of keys in the kitchen drawer, not the kind of collection that accumulates over a lifetime, keys to padlocks and cabinets and doors that may no longer exist, and Clara had taken the entire ring on the same morning she had arranged the removal of the box. She spent the better part of an hour working through them one by one, testing each in the primary lock's keyhole. None fit. The slot was too narrow for most, and the right dimensions for none. Whatever key opened this box was not on the ring, and might not be in the house at all. She thought about a locksmith. She looked up locksmiths in her area, and found several, and then sat with her phone in her hand, doing the calculation she always did when something cost money, which was the calculation of what she had against what she needed, and what the gap between them might cost her in other ways. A locksmith for a specialized mechanism would not be inexpensive. She did not know exactly what it would cost. She did not know, yet, whether it was worth the cost. That evening, after Sophia was in bed, she sat cross-legged on the living room floor in front of the box with her laptop open and began researching. She started with the markings, entering the numbers and codes she had photographed into search engines in various combinations. She found references to similar marking systems in industrial catalogs from the mid-20th century, documentation related to the manufacture of heavy-duty storage equipment for commercial and institutional use. The system suggested the box had been made to order rather than mass-produced, fitted to a specific buyer's requirements rather than manufactured for general sale. The symbol carved near the lid's edge proved harder to trace. She spent 2 hours on it without arriving at a clear identification. It appeared in partial form in several places, once in an image from a Latin American trade catalog dated to the 1950s, once in a photograph of a wall marking from a building she could not identify, once in an academic paper about craft guild markings in South American metalworking traditions that she could only access the abstract of. None of these instances provided a definitive explanation. What they suggested, collectively, was that the symbol was not random and was not decorative. It meant something to someone, and that someone had placed it there deliberately. She closed the laptop at nearly midnight and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the building. The box was visible only as a mass in the corner of the room, its details swallowed by the absence of light. She thought about what Tomas had said, about scrap metal value, and about what her uncle had said, about treasure, and about the way he had laughed. And she found that the laugh bothered her more than it had at the time, not because it was unkind, but because it was incurious. She had spent her adult life in the condition of not having quite enough, and in that condition, she had learned to pay attention to things other people dismissed. Not out of hope, exactly, but out of the discipline of attention itself, the understanding that things overlooked were not the same as things without value. She had a grandfather she had not asked enough questions of. She had a box he had kept hidden beneath a canvas in a back room, with a lock designed for something more serious than papers, and a weight that did not match its size, and a symbol whose meaning she could not yet read. She had 9 days before the notice on the kitchen table became something worse than a notice. And she had the specific quality of attention that comes to people who have learned to see what others prefer not to look at. She was not a woman who believed in luck. She was a woman who believed in work and precision, and the refusal to accept that something was worthless simply because other people found it inconvenient to value. That was not optimism. It was a different kind of thing entirely, harder and quieter and more enduring. She went to bed. In the corner of the living room, the Strongbox sat unchanged, holding its weight and its silence and whatever lay within them. Patient as only old things can be patient, indifferent to urgency, waiting for the kind of attention that would not be satisfied with surfaces. The locksmith she eventually called was not the first one she had spoken to. The first one had heard her description of the mechanism and quoted her a number that made her set the phone down for a full 30 seconds before she thanked him and ended the call. The second had said he was not familiar with that type of lock and preferred not to risk damaging it. The third, a man named Brennan who ran a small shop from a converted garage on the east side of the city, had listened to her description with a silence she had learned to distinguish from disinterest. It was the silence of someone organizing what they were hearing. When she finished, he asked 2 specific questions, for one about the keyhole dimensions and one about the secondary dial, and then said he could come and look at it. He arrived on a Thursday morning, a man in his 60s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing precise work for a long time and had stopped needing to perform expertise for anyone. He carried a case of tools and a set of reference materials, small booklets, and folded charts that he consulted without apology. He examined the box for 20 minutes before he spoke. He said it was old. He said the primary lock was of a type he had encountered twice before, both times on equipment from South American industrial sources, and that the manufacturer had been known for heavy security commercial storage. He said the secondary dial was a refinement not typically installed on this class of box, which meant the original owner had paid to have it fitted separately, after manufacture, by someone with the relevant skill. He said all of this with the same unhurried precision with which he had examined the lock, and Clara listened without interrupting. Then he said the box had been modified. She asked what he meant. He pointed to the interior edge of the primary lock housing, a section she could not see clearly even with the flashlight, and described an additional fitting that was not original to the mechanism. It was internal, he said. Someone had installed a secondary retention feature inside the primary lock that would prevent the main mechanism from releasing unless the secondary dial had already been set to a specific position. The two locks did not operate independently. They operated in sequence. The dial had to be correct before the key would turn. Without the correct dial sequence, the key was irrelevant, and without the key, the dial sequence was equally useless. Clara looked at the box for a moment, and then asked him what he thought of its weight. He looked at it with a professional's assessment and said it was heavier than it should be. He said this matter-of-factly, the way he said everything, as though the unusual was merely another category of the ordinary, requiring accurate description rather than commentary. She asked if he could open it. He said he could get through the locks, given time, but that doing so without the correct sequence would require drilling, and drilling an old iron-reinforced lock box of this construction would take most of a day and would almost certainly cause some damage to the interior of the lid mechanism. He said he would prefer not to do that unless there was no alternative, because mechanisms of this quality and age were worth preserving for their own sake, and because sometimes the damage done trying to enter something this way made it impossible to understand how it had been designed to work. He said there was another option. He had seen, in the base of the keyhole, a pattern of wear on the interior lock face that suggested the key had been used regularly over a number of years, and then not at all for a long period. So the wear was specific enough that he could produce a working key from impression casting if she would allow him to take an impression of the lock interior. It would take him several days. It would not be cheap. But if the key existed and could be reproduced, it would open the box the way it was meant to be opened, without damage, without force, in the sequence its builder had intended. Clara said yes. She said it without calculating the cost first, which was not something she did easily. But she said it with a certainty that surprised her, as though the decision had already been made somewhere below the level of deliberation, waiting only for the question to give it form. After Brennan left with his impression materials, she stood alone in the living room again with the box. Through the window, the city went about its ordinary business, and somewhere behind her in the kitchen, the notice was still on the table. She was aware of both things, the ordinary noise of the world outside and the weight of paper on her kitchen table, with the same peripheral clarity as before. The box held its silence, as it always had. But it no longer felt like the silence of something empty. It felt like the silence of something waiting to be understood on its own terms, in its own time, by someone willing to approach it with the patience it required. She touched the carved symbol on the lid one more time before she went to make lunch. The lines were worn nearly smooth, pressed down by decades of air and storage. But they were there. Someone had put them there with intention. And intention, she had learned, did not disappear simply because time had covered it over. It persisted, on the way certain things persisted, quiet and exact, waiting for the one person who would look closely enough to find it. The days that followed Brennan's visit settled into a strange double rhythm. On the surface, Clara maintained the ordinary mechanics of her life, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned that collapse is a luxury she cannot afford. She went to work. She made Sophia's lunches and signed her permission slips and listened to her describe the social dynamics of 4th grade with the full attention the subject deserved. She answered emails, managed calls, filed complaints on behalf of strangers about dripping faucets and broken locks. She kept the noise of her own situation carefully separated from the noise she was paid to manage, the way a musician keeps distinct rhythms running simultaneously without letting one dissolve into the other. But beneath that surface, she was waiting. And the waiting had a quality to it she had not expected. Something less like hope and more like held breath, the state of a person who has found a door and is waiting to learn what lies beyond it, without yet being certain it will open. She had not told anyone about Brennan's assessment. She had not told Renata. though Renata had called once to ask how she was managing and had mentioned the box in passing with a curiosity that was genuine rather than polite. She had not told Marco, who had helped her move it and who would have been interested. She had not told her mother, who would have worried, and whom she was careful to give only information that would not produce worry. She held it to herself, not because she distrusted the people around her, but because she had learned through the specific education of her circumstances that some things were best held quietly until they were more than possibility. She thought about her grandfather more in those days than she had in years. Not the old man she had known in his later life, but the younger version of him she had only glimpsed through photographs and the occasional story offered to her as a child, without context or elaboration. There was a photograph on the desk in his back room that she had taken when she cleared it out, a black and white image of a man she recognized as Arturo, perhaps 30 years old, standing in front of a building she did not recognize. He was not smiling, which was consistent with the photographs of his generation, but the quality of his stillness in the image was different from the stillness she associated with formal portrait photography. He looked like a man who knew something was happening and had made his peace with it. Behind him, the building was large and institutional, its facade visible only in part. She had not been able to identify it from the fragment shown. She kept the photograph on her kitchen table, next to the notice, and looked at them both each morning with the same quiet attention. It occurred to her, not for the first time, but with more weight than before, that she had been raised in proximity to a man whose interior life was largely unknown to her. This was not unusual in itself. Families passed generations in close physical proximity while maintaining vast distances of understanding. What made Arturo's case particular was not the distance, but the sense, growing clearer in retrospect, that the distance had been maintained with deliberate care. He had not been cold. He had not been withholding in the way of people who use silence as a form of control. He had been warm in his quiet way, present and attentive. But there had always been a portion of him that was behind a door that he kept closed without drawing attention to its existence. She had grown up accepting this without examination. Now she found herself examining it, and the examination had the quality of looking at something familiar from a new angle and realizing that the familiar shape concealed a structure you had never previously registered. She looked up what she could about the region of South America her grandfather had come from, the province he had named in his indirect way when she was a child. She found references to its history that she had not known. It had been a region of some wealth in the mid-20th century, resource extraction and trade, the kind of prosperity that produced both accumulation and instability. There had been political disruptions, the kind that South America's mid-century had produced in abundance, and in their wake, a good deal of private wealth had moved across borders by routes that were not always formal. She read this with the careful attention she brought to things she did not yet fully understand, filing the information without forcing it into conclusions that the evidence did not yet support. She was not constructing a narrative. She was assembling observations. There was a difference, and it mattered. A narrative began with a destination and arranged facts to reach it. What she was doing was the opposite, accumulating data without insisting on where it led, letting the pattern form at its own pace. This was the approach she had always taken to problems that rewarded patience, and whatever the Strongbox contained or did not contain, it was a problem that rewarded patience. Everything about it said so. On the 6th morning after Brennan's visit, he called her. He had the key. Brennan arrived at 8 in the morning, earlier than she had expected, which told her something about his interest in the problem. He was the kind of craftsman who was moved by difficulties in the way other people were moved by ambition or money, and a lock of this design and age represented a difficulty worth rising early for. He carried his case with the same unhurried efficiency as before and set it on the floor beside the box without ceremony, and opened it, and began laying out his tools, in a sequence that suggested ritual without being one. Clara had been awake since 5. She had made coffee and drunk most of it standing at the kitchen window, watching the street below fill slowly with morning. And she had thought with careful deliberateness about what she expected and what she did not allow herself to expect. And she had arrived at a position that was something like neutral readiness. The box might contain documents. It might contain the kind of objects that her grandfather had valued without them having objective worth. It might contain things she could not anticipate. She held all of these possibilities with equal weight and refused to privilege any of them. She had lived long enough in proximity to disappointment to understand the particular cruelty of hope that outpaces evidence. Sophia was at school. Clara had made sure of that, had walked her to the corner herself rather than watching from the window as she sometimes did, and had stood until Sophia disappeared into the building before turning back. This was not a day she wanted her daughter present for. Whatever happened, she needed to encounter it alone first. Brennan examined the secondary dial first, working through a sequence of positions with the methodical patience of someone who has spent decades learning to listen to mechanisms rather than force them. He explained what he was doing as he went, not in a teaching way, but in the way of a person who thinks aloud as a working method. The dial, he said, had a resistance pattern that was specific to a short range of positions. Within that range, one position would align the internal fitting he had described, releasing the primary lock's retention feature. He was working through the range by feel, he said, because the dial had no markings, and the correct position was not indicated by any external sign. It was known only to whoever had said it, or to whoever had been told. Clara watched him work. She had positioned herself on the couch where she could see without being in the way, and she kept her hands in her lap and her breathing even. The room was very quiet. Outside, a garbage truck made its way down the street, and the mechanical sounds of it reached the apartment in a muted, some distant register that seemed to belong to a different layer of existence. Brennan stopped. He adjusted his grip on the dial and turned it a fraction of a position, and then stopped again. He held it there. Then he said, quietly and without drama, that he had it. He reached for the key he had made, a piece of dark metal filed to the specific profile of the lock interior's wear pattern, and inserted it into the primary keyhole. He turned it with measured pressure, neither forcing nor hesitating. Clara heard the mechanism move. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound of a thing working the way it was built to work, a series of internal shifts and releases that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and then settled into a new configuration. He looked at her. She nodded. He pressed his palm flat against the lid of the box, exactly where she had pressed her own hand days earlier, and lifted. The lid was heavy. It rose on hinges that moved with the careful precision of engineering that had been maintained by time, rather than degraded by it, a quality she had not anticipated. There was no resistance, no rust-frozen protest. The hinges had been fitted with a lubricant that had hardened into something between grease and resin, still functional after decades. Whoever had built this box had understood that the mechanism needed to work not just in the present, but in a future they could not see. The interior was divided. This was the first thing she registered, the structural fact of it. The space inside the box was not a single open compartment, but a constructed interior, fitted with a framework of dark wood and metal dividers that organized the space into distinct sections. It was the interior of something that had been designed for specific contents rather than general storage, the way a craftsman's case is fitted to the tools it carries rather than to tools in the abstract. The uppermost layer held documents. They were enclosed in a fitted case of oilskin or something similar, sealed at the edges with a wax compound that had held its integrity entirely. Brennan carefully lifted the case and set it on the coffee table without opening it. Beneath it, in the second layer of the divided interior, there were objects wrapped in cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old paper. The wrappings were tied with cord rather than taped, the knots precise and consistent, or the kind tied by someone who intended them to be opened again. Clara stood without realizing she had done so. She was on her feet beside Brennan, looking into the box, and she did not remember moving from the couch. She was aware of her own breathing and of the particular quality of stillness in the room. The garbage truck now gone, the street outside briefly quiet, as though the ordinary world had paused out of some instinct she could not have named. Brennan looked at her and said he thought she should handle the rest herself. He said this without elaborating, but she understood what he meant. Whatever was here had been put here by her grandfather for reasons that were private and possibly significant, and those reasons belonged to her family and not to him. He was a locksmith. His work was the mechanism. What the mechanism had protected was hers. She thanked him. He gave her a card and said to call if she needed anything further, and let himself out, quietly, as he had done everything. She heard the door close behind him, and then she was alone in the room with the open box and the still air and the oilskin case on the coffee table and the cloth-wrapped objects in the second layer of the interior and the third layer, which she had not yet examined, below them. She sat on the floor in front of the box. She did not immediately reach in. She let herself look. The interior construction was as precise as everything else about the box. The dividers were fitted with a joiner's skill, their corners clean, their surfaces smooth where they met. The cloth wrappings in the second layer were arranged with care, each object individually wrapped and placed without crowding, the way someone wraps things they intend to last. There were 7 of them. She could tell that much from her position, though she could not tell through the wrappings what they contained. The shapes were variable. Some were flat and rectangular. Some were more irregular. One was notably larger than the others. Below the second layer, visible at the edges where the dividers did not reach to the bottom, she could see the third layer. It was darker there, the light not reaching it cleanly. But she could see enough to register that the third layer was different in character from the first 2. It held something that was not wrapped in cloth and not enclosed in a case. It held something that caught the light differently, with the particular quality of surfaces that are dense and reflective and not organic in origin. She picked up the oilskin case first. The wax seal resisted for a moment, and then gave way cleanly, splitting along its edge without crumbling. The case opened. Inside, the documents had been preserved with a care she had not fully appreciated from the outside. Each sheet was separated from the next by a thin layer of treated paper, the kind used for archival storage. The sheets themselves were heavy, the kind of paper that was made before the mid-century shift to thinner, faster production stock. The ink was dark and even, well preserved by the seal. She spread the documents on the coffee table and went through them slowly. The first several were in Spanish, a formal register she had to read carefully, so not because her Spanish was poor, but because the vocabulary was specific to a context she was not immediately familiar with. They were legal documents of some kind, their language the language of official transaction, of transfer and authorization and certification. She could read the key terms clearly enough. She could see her grandfather's name, Arturo Medina, in multiple places. She could see dates from the early 1960s. She could see references to valuations and to a process she did not yet fully understand, a transfer of assets conducted under conditions she would need help interpreting. There was a letter, handwritten in a script that was neat and careful, addressed to no one by name but clearly written to someone specific. It was her grandfather's handwriting. She recognized it from the labels on his boxes, from the birthday cards he had sent her as a child, from the notes she had found in his desk drawers. She read it slowly, twice, sitting on the floor, with the coffee table between her and the open Strongbox. The letter did not explain everything. It was not written as an explanation. It was written as a set of instructions and a record of intent, the kind of document a man leaves when he wants something known after he is gone, but does not want to speak of it directly while he is alive. He had acquired certain things, the letter said. He had acquired them in a period of difficulty and movement, during a time when the region he had left was not safe for what he held, and he had moved them because they needed to be protected, and he was the one capable of protecting them. And he had not spoken of them because speaking of them created risks he was not willing to accept, not for himself, but for those around him. He had kept them because they were not only his to decide about. They belonged, in the way that certain things belong, to the family he had built, and to whatever lay ahead of it. He had written that he hoped whoever found this would not be in a hurry. He had written that the value of what was here was real and had been verified, but that it would need to be verified again, properly, by the right people, before anything could be done with it. He had written down 2 names and a city, and he had written that these names would know what to do. He had written, at the end of the letter, in the careful handwriting of a man who had chosen his words over a long time. I kept this for the years ahead. I knew there would be years that needed it. I am sorry I did not find a way to tell you. Some things are safer, as silence, until they become something better. Clara sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she set it down carefully and reached into the second layer of the box. She unwrapped the first cloth package. Her hands were steady. She had not expected them to be, but they were, moving with the same controlled precision she brought to tasks that required attention, the same hands that managed other people's paperwork and signed permission slips and sorted through her grandfather's desk. The cord came loose and the cloth fell open. Inside was a bar, rectangular, dense, its surface bearing the particular matte sheen of metal that has been cast and set and held without disturbance for a very long time. It was smaller than she would have imagined from its weight, though she had not touched it yet. Her first impression was of color, the color of old gold, which is different from the color of new gold in the way that seasoned wood is different from fresh cut, a depth and saturation that comes only from time. There were markings on its surface, stamped characters, and a seal she could not immediately read. She lifted it with both hands. The weight of it was absolute, not heavy in the way of large objects, but heavy in the way of dense ones, weight concentrated into a small volume with a completeness that registered immediately in her wrists and forearms. She held it for a moment, feeling the reality of it, the specific physical fact of it, and then set it carefully on the floor beside her. She unwrapped the second package, another bar, the same color, the same weight, the same markings, or close to them. She would need to compare them directly to be certain. She unwrapped the third, then the fourth, then the fifth, sixth, and seventh. 7 bars in the second layer alone. She set them in a row on the floor and looked at them, and the looking was a strange experience, not what she would have predicted. She had expected, if this was what she was beginning to believe it was, to feel something large and overwhelming, a surge of emotion proportionate to the significance of the moment. What she felt instead was a very deep and very specific stillness, the kind that comes when the mind encounters something it has not prepared a category for and suspends its ordinary processing while it constructs one. She breathed. She looked at the 7 bars in a row on her living room floor. She looked at the open box with its third layer still unexamined. She looked at the oilskin case and the documents spread on the coffee table and the letter in her grandfather's handwriting that said some things are safer as silence until they become something better. Then she reached into the third layer. The third layer was deeper than the second. The dividers that separated it from the layer above stopped before reaching the bottom, creating a full-width compartment that ran the length and breadth of the interior. The objects here were not wrapped in cloth. They were arranged directly in the space, fitted against each other with the kind of careful placement that uses space efficiently without waste. She lifted the first one out with both hands. It was larger than the bars, longer, its shape more rectangular and flat. Its surface had the same quality of color, but was different in texture, marked along its face with a geometric pattern that served the dual function of identification and anti-counterfeiting, a design feature she recognized dimly from things she had read. She turned it in her hands, reading what she could from the stamped characters. The numbers, the unit designations, the serial markings. Her Spanish was sufficient for the language. The system of measurement and designation was less immediately familiar, but the numbers were legible and their scale was not ambiguous. She lifted out a second, a third, a fourth and fifth together, wrapped against each other with a strip of the same treated paper she had found between the documents. By the time she reached the back of the third layer, she had stopped counting individual pieces and was instead simply lifting and placing, the way a person sorting a crate of objects enters a physical rhythm that suspends the interpretive mind. When the third layer was empty, she sat back and looked at what she had removed. The bars, all of them now out of the box and arranged on the floor in the order she had found them, were 23 in total. 7 from the second layer, 16 from the third. They varied slightly in size, the smaller ones from the second layer and the larger, heavier ones from the third. But they shared the same character, the same markings, the same dense and measured weight. There was also, in the far back corner of the third layer, a small wooden box she had not noticed until she had removed everything around it. It was sealed with a simple clasp, not locked, and inside it, she found a collection of objects that were different in kind from the bars, but not, she would later understand, different in significance. There were coins, heavy and old, their faces bearing portraits and inscriptions she could not immediately read. There were stones, small and unset, wrapped individually in squares of chamois, and there were documents of a different kind than those in the oilskin case, more technical in nature, bearing the stamps and seals of institutions whose names she did not recognize, but whose official character was unmistakable. She sat on the floor of her living room surrounded by the contents of her grandfather's strongbox for a period of time she could not afterward accurately account for. The light through the windows shifted. The street outside went through its ordinary cycles of noise and quiet. She was aware of all of it at a great distance, the way a diver is aware of the surface, while the immediate reality is what lies beneath it. Eventually, she picked up her phone and looked at the time. It was early afternoon. Sophia would be released from school in 2 hours. She had, by her own rough accounting, 2 hours before her life was required to resume its ordinary shape. She used the first of those hours sitting very still, and she used the second of them doing what she knew how to do, which was research. She photographed everything. Every bar, every coin, every stone, every document. She photographed the markings on the bars from multiple angles, the stamps and seals on the documents, the hallmarks and inscriptions on the coins. So she was systematic and thorough, the way she had been with the exterior of the box, the way she had always been with things that required documentation, which was everything that mattered. Then she searched. The markings on the bars were consistent with a South American assay system from the mid-20th century. She found references to the specific stamp configuration in academic papers on Latin American precious metal certification, in numismatic archives, in the documentation of a regulatory body that had been active in the region her grandfather had come from. The designation indicated refined gold of high purity, certified by an institution whose records still existed in part, in digitized form, in the archive of a university she had never heard of until today. She looked at the coins with the same careful attention. Several were identifiable from numismatic databases, pieces from the early 20th century, some rare enough that the databases listed values with a specificity that made her read the numbers twice, and then a third time. They were not all of equal rarity or value, but none of them were ordinary, and several of them were extraordinary in a way that the databases described in the dry, precise language of scholarly valuation, which somehow made the numbers more rather than less real. The unset stones she photographed and set aside. She could not assess them with the tools she had available, and she was not going to speculate without basis. By the time she put down her phone and went to pick up Sophia from school, she had not arrived at a number. She did not try to. The numbers she had found in her research were reference points, data, the beginning of an inquiry rather than its conclusion. She knew enough to know that what her grandfather had kept was real and significant. She did not know enough to know how significant. That would require expertise she did not have. It would require the names in the letter, and the city he had written beside them, and the conversations those names could facilitate. She walked to Sophia's school with the same face she always wore, the face of a woman managing the ordinary demands of an ordinary afternoon, and she held her daughter's hand on the walk home and listened to her describe a disagreement at recess with the same full attention she always gave. And she made dinner and supervised homework and read 2 chapters of a book they were working through together. Oh, and when Sophia was asleep, she sat again in the living room with the reassembled box in its corner and the documents in their oilskin case on the coffee table and the small wooden box on the shelf beside her grandfather's photograph, and she allowed herself, for the first time since morning, to feel what she had been holding at a careful distance all day. It was not what she would have called joy. It was not relief exactly, though it contained elements of relief. It was something older and quieter than either of those, something that sat below the register of ordinary emotion and had the quality of a foundation rather than a feeling. Her grandfather had kept something real. He had kept it for the years ahead, he had written, for the years that would need it. She was 34 years old, and she was 9 days from losing her apartment, and she was the daughter of his daughter, and she was here in the specific years he had described without knowing their particulars, and she had found what he had left. She did not cry. She sat with it. She let the weight of it settle into her, the way the weight of the bars had settled into her hands when she lifted them, immediate and specific and impossible to misunderstand. The letter said the names would know what to do. She would find the names. She would go to the city. She would do it methodically and carefully, the way she did everything that required methodical care. But first, she would sleep, because the day had taken from her a quantity of energy she had not known she possessed, and the days ahead were going to require her to be rested and clear-headed and precise. She turned off the lamp. In the corner, the Strongbox sat as it had always sat, unchanged by having been opened, patient in the way of things that have been waiting a long time and have learned that patience is its own form of certainty. The small wooden box on the shelf caught a sliver of light from the street outside. The photograph of her grandfather at 30 looked at nothing in particular, with the particular stillness of a man who knew what was happening and had made his peace with it. Clara went to bed. She slept, deeply and without dreaming, for the first time in weeks. The city Arturo had named in his letter was not far, a 4-hour drive that she arranged for the following Saturday, leaving Sophia with Marco's family, who had always been the kind of people who opened their door without requiring reasons. She told Marco she had some business to handle related to her grandfather's estate, which was true, and Marco said to take as long as she needed, which was the kind of uncomplicated generosity she had learned over the years to receive without deflecting. She brought the documents in the oilskin case and a selection of photographs on her phone, and a notebook in which she had written down everything she understood so far, organized by category, with space left beside each entry for what she did not yet know. The drive took her through the flatlands east of the city, and then through a stretch of low hills, and then into a metropolitan area she had visited twice before in her life, once as a child and once for a work conference that she had attended and returned from without particular impression. She arrived before noon and found the address from the letter without difficulty. The firm was small and established in the way that certain specialized businesses are established, occupying a narrow building on a quiet street, with a sign that was old enough to have earned its plainness. The name on the sign matched one of the two names from her grandfather's letter. She stood outside for a moment looking at it before she went in. The man who eventually met with her was the son of the man her grandfather had named. The original contact had died, she was told gently by the receptionist, some years before. But his son had continued the practice, specializing, as his father had, in the authentication and appraisal of precious metals, rare coins, and related assets, with a particular focus on South American origin items from the mid-20th century. He was a man in his 50s, with a careful manner and eyes that assessed things, people, and objects alike, with the professional habit of someone who has trained his attention over a long career. His name was Estrada. He looked at the documents she laid on his desk and did not speak for several minutes. He turned pages with gloved hands, reading with the focused attention of someone who is not merely reading, but recognizing. When he looked up, his expression had the quality of a man who has been waiting for something and is now deciding whether he is prepared for it to have arrived. He asked her where the box was. She told him it was in her apartment, secured. He asked if she had moved any of the contents. She said she had removed everything for photography and documentation purposes and replaced it afterward. He nodded at this. He asked if anyone else had seen the contents. She said only the locksmith who had opened it, who had left before she removed anything. He nodded at this too. He said he would need to examine the items directly. He said this wasn't negotiable, not because he doubted her documentation, which was thorough, he said, looking at the photographs on her phone, with an expression she could not quite read, but because authentication of assets of this type and potential magnitude required direct physical examination and comparison against reference standards he maintained in his office. He said it could not be done in an afternoon. She asked him, carefully, what he thought he was looking at. She asked this not because she needed his validation, but because she needed to understand whether what she had was what her research suggested it was. And she had learned early in life that the right question asked to the right person at the right moment was worth more than any amount of independent research. Estrada looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the photographs again. Then he said he would need to examine the items before he could say anything with certainty, and that she should understand that clearly. He was not making a commitment based on photographs and documents, but he said, setting down her phone and folding his hands on the desk in the manner of someone preparing a measured statement, that if the items were what the documentation suggested they were and what the photographs appeared to show, then what she had brought to his attention was not a small matter. He said the documentation alone, if verified, would establish a provenance chain for the assets that was cleaner than most material of this age and origin that came through his office. He said the stamps and assay markings visible in her photographs were consistent with a certification system he knew well, one that he had spent a significant part of his career studying, and that the material bearing those marks, if genuine, would be of a quality and purity that the current precious metals market valued without ambiguity. She asked about the coins. He picked up her phone again and scrolled through the photographs slowly. He paused on several of them. He said 3 of the coins she had photographed were pieces he had not seen outside of institutional collections in over 20 years. He named them by their designations, using terminology she did not have, but his tone as he named them was enough. It was the tone of a man who spends his professional life in proximity to rarity and has not lost his ability to be moved by it. He asked about the stones. She said she had not attempted to assess them. She had photographs. He looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. When he spoke, he said he preferred not to speculate about those until he had seen them in person. She drove home with the documents and the photographs and the notebook, and she sat in the parking lot outside her building for 15 minutes before going in. The notice was still on the kitchen table. 9 days had become 2 days while she had been doing other things. She looked at it with a different quality of attention than she had given it before. Not relief. Not yet. The appointment with Estrada was scheduled for the following Thursday. Nothing was confirmed. Nothing was certain. But the texture of the situation had changed in a way that was real, even if it was not yet translatable into the language the notice required. She called the management company that evening and asked for a short extension. She did not explain why. She asked in the careful, neutral tone she had developed over years of managing other people's requests to the same kind of office, and the person she spoke to said they would note the request and she would hear back within 24 hours. She said thank you and ended the call. Then she sat across from the Strongbox and looked at it in the evening light. She thought about the weight of it, the first time Marco had lifted a corner and exhaled in surprise. She thought about the sound of the lock releasing, the 2 seconds of internal movement that had reorganized everything. She thought about her grandfather at 30 in front of an unidentified building, his stillness in the image, his understanding that something was happening. She thought about the letter, the specific words of it, the years ahead, and the years that would need it. She had 9 days left on the notice, or perhaps more if the extension came through. She had a Thursday appointment with a man whose father, her grandfather, had trusted enough to name in a letter he had written for after he was gone. She had a box in the corner that had held it secret through decades of family visits and arguments and assessments of worthlessness and one morning of particular care, and a locksmith who had listened before he spoke. Outside, the city went on. The street below held its ordinary noise. Sophia was asleep in the next room with the uncomplicated ease of a 9-year-old who does not yet know that the ground can shift. Clara did not know yet what Thursday would bring. She knew what it might bring. She knew what the photographs suggested and what Estrada's careful language had implied, and what the weight of 23 bars on her living room floor had communicated in the direct, unambiguous language of physical reality. She knew that things overlooked were not the same as things without value. She had known that for as long as she could remember. She turned off the lamp and went to check on her daughter, and then went to bed. And this time, when she slept, it was with the particular quality of a woman who has done everything that the day required and left nothing undone that was in her power to do, which was its own kind of rest, earned and specific and deeper than the kind that comes from exhaustion alone. The Strongbox sat in the dark, unchanged, as it had always sat. Patient as only old things are patient, as certain as only kept things are certain. Thursday arrived the way important days arrive when you are waiting for them, with a surface indistinguishable from any other morning. Clara made coffee. She made Sophia's lunch. She dropped her at school. No, she drove the 4 hours with the oilskin case on the passenger seat and the small wooden box wrapped in a towel in the back seat, and the 23 bars distributed in a duffel bag she had borrowed from Marco, who had helped her load the car at 7 in the morning without asking a single question, which was among the most significant gifts anyone had given her in recent memory. Estrada had a room at the back of his office that was equipped for examination work. It had the quality of a laboratory, clean and ordered, with surfaces that were clear and bright, and tools that were arranged with the same precision she had noted in Brennan's case. the precision of a craftsman who respects his instruments. He wore gloves throughout. He worked slowly. He began with the documents, started comparing them against records he accessed through a system on his desk, cross-referencing serial designations against a registry she had not known existed. He made notes in a small book without sharing them as he went. She sat in a chair against the wall and watched with her hands in her lap. He moved to the bars. He examined each one in sequence, using a loop and a set of reference stamps and a spectrometric device that he explained briefly, a tool for confirming metal composition without damaging the surface. He worked through all 23 without breaking the sequence. Occasionally, he paused longer on one than on the others. Occasionally, he said something very quietly in Spanish that she could hear but not fully make out. He did not look at her while he worked. He looked at the bars. The coins he treated with particular care, he lifting each from its wrapping with 2 fingers and examining it under magnification, consulting a reference volume that he kept on a stand to his left. For 3 of them, he set down the loop and used a second instrument, something more refined, and examined them again. For one of these 3, he spent nearly 20 minutes before setting it down. The stones he left for last. He examined them in a different way, using a different set of instruments, and his stillness during this examination was of a different quality than the stillness he had maintained during the rest of the assessment. It wasn't the stillness of concentration. It was the stillness of a man who is deciding how to manage what he is seeing. When he finished, he removed his gloves and set them on the corner of the examination table and stood for a moment looking at the objects arranged before him with the expression of someone organizing a very large amount of information into the correct order. Then he sat down across from her. He said the documentation was verified. The provenance chain was intact. The certification marks on the bars matched the registry for a batch of refined gold, certified by the institution she had found in her research, a batch recorded as having left its source in the early 1960s and subsequently lost to documentation. Lost was the word used in the registry, he said. It was the word used when an asset left official records and did not re-enter them. The assets had been real. They had been certified. And then they had been moved by someone who understood that movement, or in that particular time and place was necessary. She asked about the value. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the bars alone, based on current spot prices and the premium applicable to certified mid-century South American gold with clean provenance documentation, represented a figure he would not state as a final number until a full formal appraisal was complete, but that she should understand was very substantial. He said very substantial, with the precision of someone who uses language carefully and means exactly what he says, no more and no less. She asked him to approximate. He was quiet again. Then he said, the bars, at current values, were in a range that began above $80 million and didn't end there. She kept her hands in her lap. She kept her face steady. She said after a moment, "What about the rest?" He looked at the coins and the stones for a moment, and then back at her. He said the coins, conservatively, in a private sale to the right buyer, would add somewhere between 12 and 22 million, with one of the 3 exceptional pieces accounting for a large portion of that figure. He said the stones, and here he paused again. The stones required a gemological specialist he could recommend and whose assessment he could not preempt. But he said that, in his opinion, formed over 30 years of work in this area, the stones were not what one found in ordinary circumstances. He said that, in his opinion, the total picture, when the gemological assessment was added to the metals and the coins, would be a figure that he described, in the careful, qualified language of a man who does not overstate, as potentially exceeding $300 million. He said this, and then he waited. Clara sat in her chair against the wall of the examination room, with the objects her grandfather had kept for 40 years, arranged on the table between them, and the letter in her bag that said he had kept them for the years ahead, and the notice in her kitchen at home with 2 days left on it, and her daughter asleep in a school 4 hours away. And she looked at Estrada and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "What do I do now?" He said that was the right question. He said he would help her answer it step by step if she would allow him to. He said there were legal structures to navigate and tax considerations and a process of formal documentation and authentication that would need to be completed before anything could be transferred or realized. He said none of this was simple, but none of it was impossible. He said her grandfather had been careful, more careful than most, and that the care he had taken made what came next more straightforward than it would otherwise be. He said her grandfather had known what he was doing. Clara looked at the bars on the table, the coins, the wrapped stones. She thought about the box in the corner of her living room, heavy and patient and silent. She thought about the symbol carved into the lid, worn nearly smooth by years of accumulated air. She thought about Arturo at 30, still in front of a building she could not identify, on making his peace with what was happening. She said, yes, he did. The process that followed was not fast. Clara had not expected it to be. She had learned early in her adult life that the things worth having required patience, and that patience was not passivity, but a specific form of active endurance, the willingness to do the work required at each stage without demanding that the stages arrive faster than they were capable of arriving. Estrada had been clear about this from the beginning. There were legal structures to navigate. There were authentication processes to complete. There were tax considerations and reporting requirements, and a chain of documentation that needed to be assembled with the precision of something that would withstand scrutiny, because it would be scrutinized carefully and repeatedly, so by people whose professional function was to find the places where provenance chains broke. Arturo's chain did not break. This was what became clear over the weeks that followed, as Estrada's referrals led her to a lawyer who specialized in exactly this kind of asset recovery, and the lawyer's review of the documents confirmed what Estrada had said in his examination room. The certifications were real, the provenance was intact. The movement of assets out of the region in the early 1960s had been conducted in a way that was legally defensible under the frameworks applicable at the time, and the documentation Arturo had preserved supported that defense at every point he had anticipated being challenged. He had been extraordinarily careful. He had understood, in a way that only someone with direct experience of instability could understand, that the legitimacy of what he held would matter as much as the holding of it, and he had protected both. The lawyer's name was Vasquez, a woman in her late 40s, with a direct manner and a precision in her use of language that Clara found immediately reassuring. Vasquez reviewed the oilskin case in a single long session, and then looked at Clara across her desk and said that in her career, she had seen 3 cases of comparable asset recovery, all of them in the South American provenance category, and none of them had arrived with documentation this complete. She said this without flourish. She said it the way she said everything, as a fact that was relevant and worth stating. She said it would take time. She said 3 to 5 months for the formal authentication and legal clearance process, longer if complications arose, though she did not anticipate complications given the state of the documentation. She said Clara would need to be patient and careful, and would need to speak to no one about what she had found until the process was sufficiently advanced that speaking about it carried no risk of complicating the legal status of the assets. Clara said she understood. Vasquez said there was a temporary mechanism available that would allow Clara to address immediate financial pressures while the larger process proceeded. She said this matter-of-factly, as though it were an administrative detail rather than the specific lifeline Clara had been holding her breath about since the notice had first arrived on her kitchen table. a small advance, secured against the anticipated recovery, administered through proper legal channels, was sufficient to stabilize her situation while the full process ran its course. Clara drove home from that meeting in a state that she could not have described accurately to anyone who asked. Not euphoria. Not relief in the way relief is usually described. Something more like the sensation of a weight that has been carried so long the carrying has become indistinguishable from the body itself, and then is suddenly, gently, set down, and the body has to learn, slowly, what it feels like to stand without it. She sat in the car outside her building for a while before going in. The street was the same street it had always been. The building was the same building. Through the window of the apartment above hers, she could see the blue flicker of a television. Down the block, a man was walking a dog with the unhurried pace of an evening that made no demands. Everything was ordinary. Nothing had changed in any way that was visible from the outside. Inside the apartment, the Strongbox sat in its corner. She stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at it for a moment. Then she walked over and placed her palm flat on the lid, the way she had done the very first night, when it was still locked, and she was still measuring the distance between what she had and what it might contain. She said quietly, to no one, or perhaps to someone, "Thank you." Then she went to make dinner for her daughter. The months that followed had a quality she had not experienced before, a strange compound of the ordinary and the extraordinary running simultaneously, without resolving into each other. She went to work. She managed Sophia's school schedule and her own. She spoke to Vasquez at intervals, receiving careful updates in the measured language of legal process, each one incrementally further along the chain than the last. She met twice more with Estrada, once to facilitate the gemological assessment he had arranged through a specialist colleague, once to review the formal appraisal report when it was complete. The gemological assessment took 3 weeks and produced a document she read in Estrada's office while he sat across from her with his hands folded and his expression attentive in the way of someone watching a person receive information they have been preparing themselves for. The stones were what he had declined to speculate about. They were what she had suspected, in the careful, disciplined way she permitted herself to suspect things. And from the moment she had lifted them out of the small wooden box and felt their weight and their specific, dense quality of light. She did not speak immediately when she finished reading. She looked at the numbers on the page in the way she had looked at the bars on her living room floor, with the suspension of ordinary processing that came from encountering something the mind had not prepared a category for. Then she set the document down and said, "Is this figure accurate?" Estrada said it was the specialist's figure, based on a thorough examination, and that he had reviewed the methodology and found nothing to question in it. He said the stones were exceptional in ways that the gemological community would find significant. He said that the largest of them, the one the specialist had spent the most time with, was of a provenance and quality that he had not seen outside of auction documentation for material at the very high end of the market. He said he expected there would be significant institutional interest when the time came. The formal appraisal report, when Vasquez incorporated it into the legal documentation, produced a total figure that Estrada had approached in his initial estimate, and the reality slightly exceeded. The full assessed value of the contents of Arturo Medina's Strongbox, inclusive of the certified gold bars, the rare coins, and the unset gemstones, with provenance documentation intact and authentication complete, was $318 million. Clara read that figure in Vasquez's office on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with rain on the windows and a cup of coffee she had been given and had not yet touched, and she sat with it for a full minute before she said anything. Vasquez waited. She was the kind of person who understood the value of allowing silence its natural length. When Clara spoke, she asked about Sophia. Vasquez said she understood. She said the structure they would put in place would be designed with generational considerations as a primary concern. She said there were mechanisms that would protect and preserve a portion of what Clara had recovered for Sophia's future, in ways that were durable and transparent and legally sound. She said Arturo had left the right documentation to make all of that possible. Clara nodded. She picked up the coffee. Outside, the rain moved across the windows in slow diagonal lines. She thought about the notice on the kitchen table, the one that had been face down for 11 days when her grandfather died. She thought about the bakery and the property management phones, and the calculation she did every month with the same quiet precision and the gap that would not close, no matter how carefully she calculated. She thought about Sophia, asking if the box was a pirate chest, and touching the rust with her fingers, and saying it felt like scales. She thought about Arturo at 30, still in front of a building she had never identified, making his peace with what was happening. She thought about Tomas saying scrap metal value, and about her uncle laughing, and about Delia in the doorway of the back room delivering her verdict without crouching, without touching, or without any of the preliminary attention the situation had called for. She did not think about these things with bitterness. She held them with the same neutral accuracy she brought to everything, noting them as facts rather than injuries, recording them as part of the sequence of events rather than as evidence against the people who had participated in them. They had looked and seen nothing. That was not a crime. That was the ordinary operation of attention, which is always limited by what it has learned to value. She had looked and seen something. That was the whole of the difference. The legal process completed in the 4th month. The assets were formally transferred under the structures Vasquez had constructed, and the first material consequence of that transfer arrived in a form that was mundane and specific and real. So a deposit that resolved, in a single action, every financial obligation that had been accumulating against Clara for the better part of 3 years. The rent, the medical bills from the year Sophia had been sick, and the insurance had not covered what it should have covered, the credit cards she had used carefully and with discipline, but had not been able to clear. All of it resolved. Not gradually, not in installments, but at once, the way a debt that has been held too long is best addressed when the means finally arrive. She sat with the confirmation documents for a long time. They were not dramatic. They were the ordinary administrative language of financial settlement, the dry vocabulary of cleared balances and satisfied obligations. She read each one with the same attention she gave to everything important, so noting the specific language, verifying the amounts, ensuring that nothing was ambiguous. And when she had read them all, she set them in a neat stack on the kitchen table, in the place where the eviction notice had sat for 11 days, and she looked at the stack for a moment, and she thought about what her grandfather had said. For the years ahead, he had written. For the years that would need it. These had been those years, and what he had kept had been exactly sufficient to meet them. The question of telling people was one she had thought about carefully over the months of the process, in the way she thought about everything consequential, with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that how things are said shapes what they become. Vasquez had said to wait until the process was complete before speaking to anyone outside the legal and appraisal team. Clara had waited, but she had also, in the waiting, considered what she would say, and to whom, and in what order. She told Marco first. He was the person who had lifted the box and asked no questions, and handed Sophia over on Saturday mornings, and said, "Take as long as you need," in the particular tone of someone who means it, without qualification. She told him over dinner at his kitchen table, with his wife Elena present, because Marco and Elena had been a unit in every significant conversation she had ever had with either of them, and it would not have felt honest to separate them. She told them the whole of it, from the canvas-draped box in the back room to Estrada's office, to the number in Vasquez's documentation. Marco was quiet for a long time after she finished. Elena made a sound that was between a laugh and something else and covered her mouth with her hand. Then Marco said, in a voice that was careful and contained in the way his voice became when something had moved him and he wasn't ready to fully admit it, "Your grandfather." Clara said yes. Marco said, "He knew." She said yes. He said nothing else for a moment. Then he said he was very glad she had made him help carry it. She laughed, and after a moment he did too. And Elena laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen in the way that laughter fills a room when it is the right kind. The kind that is not at anyone's expense, but simply at the fact of things turning out the way they have turned out, against the weight of reasonable expectation. She told Renata next. Renata, who had been the only other voice in the family that had said, at least try to open it before deciding, who had caught Clara's eye in the doorway of the back room and said nothing, which had been its own kind of response. She told her over the phone because Renata lived across the state, and a visit was not practical on short notice, and Renata listened through the entire account without interrupting, which was not Renata's natural inclination and indicated the depth of her attention. When Clara finished, Renata said, "I knew there was something in it." Clara said she had not known, not for certain, until Brennan lifted the lid. Renata said, "No, I knew there was something in the whole situation. The way he kept it, the way he never talked about where he came from, not really, and I always thought there was more there than any of us were asking about." Clara said she wished she had asked more questions when she could have. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He answered the one that mattered. He just answered it this way instead of with words." Clara thought about that for a long time after the call. She told her mother on a Sunday afternoon in her mother's apartment, sitting at the table where Clara had done homework as a child, with coffee and the particular afternoon light that came through her mother's windows in a way that had not changed in 30 years. Her mother was 61 and had worked the same food service job for 19 years and carried the specific quality of tiredness that came not from any single burden, but from the long accumulation of managed difficulty, the tiredness of a woman who had not had enough for most of her adult life and had learned to make enough function as adequacy. When Clara told her, her mother did not respond immediately. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the table. Then she looked at Clara with an expression that was complex, in the way that a face becomes complex when it is managing several true things simultaneously, things that do not resolve each other, but must coexist. She said, "He never told me." She said it without accusation, or if there was accusation in it, it was directed at something other than her father, something more like the circumstances that had required the silence. She said it the way you say something you have long suspected and are not entirely surprised to have confirmed, but are still, in the confirmation of it, sorrowful. Then Clara reached across the table and took her mother's hand. Her mother looked at their hands and then looked at her daughter and said, "What are you going to do?" Clara told her. She had been thinking about it for months in the parallel track that had run beneath the administrative work of the process, the track that was not about how, but about what, not about mechanism, but about meaning. She had thought about what her grandfather had said about the years ahead, and she had thought about the specific years she had lived, and she had thought about the gap, the one that had never closed, no matter how carefully she calculated, and about all the people she knew who lived with the same gap, who managed it with the same precision and endurance she had managed it with, and who would continue to manage it with no expectation that it would ever be otherwise. She had thought about her grandfather, who had understood that there would be years that needed something, and who had protected that something for long enough to deliver it. She had thought about what it meant to protect something for the future, not just for one person, but for the people around that person, for the conditions in which a life was lived. She told her mother what she was going to do. Her mother listened. When Clara finished, her mother was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "He would have liked that." Clara said, "I think so too." There was a conversation she had been aware of needing to have, and had been in no hurry toward, and which arrived on its own terms rather than on hers. It arrived at a family gathering, not one of the first since the estate had been settled, a dinner at Delia's house that had the quality of most family gatherings in the months after a death, a careful resumption of ordinary life with a new configuration and the awareness, not always spoken, of the absence at its center. Delia had heard by then. The family had heard. Clara had not broadcast the discovery, but she had not concealed it either. Not from the people who were owed an honest account of what had been found in the house that was their shared inheritance. The information had moved through the family with the particular velocity of news that is both significant and personal, the kind that everyone hears about quickly and then processes at their own pace. She had spoken to each of the relevant family members directly before the dinner, while ensuring that no one encountered the information secondhand without a prior conversation. This had been important to her. The how of things mattered, and how people learned things shaped what the things meant to them. Delia had been one of those conversations. It had been brief and not without difficulty, not because Delia was unkind, but because Delia was a woman who had organized her understanding of the world on certain foundations, and did not find it easy when a foundation shifted. She had looked at Clara across her kitchen table and said, "I told you to throw it away." She had said it with a flatness that was not quite regret and not quite acknowledgement, but something in the vicinity of both. Clara had said, "I know." She had not said anything else because nothing else was necessary. At the dinner itself, there was the awkwardness that was inevitable and that Clara had expected. Tomas was quieter than usual, which was its own kind of eloquence. Her uncle Raphael was the first to say something direct, in the way he did most things, without excessive management of the approach. He said he was glad she had not listened to them. He said it plainly, at the table, in earshot of everyone, and the plainness of it was what made it land cleanly, rather than catching on edges. There was a moment after dinner when Delia found Clara in the kitchen, where she had gone to refill her glass. It was the kind of moment that domestic spaces create, the brief interval of privacy in a setting full of people. Delia stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. She said she hoped Clara understood that she had not said what she said about the box out of any malice. She said she had simply not seen what was there. Clara said she understood that. Delia said, "Your grandfather always said you paid attention, even when you were very small. He said you paid attention to things the rest of us walked past." Clara had not known this. She stood with her glass in her hand and held the information with the same careful attention she brought to everything her grandfather had left behind, every object and document and word spoken or unspoken. She said, "He never told me that." Delia said, "No. He kept things. You know how he was. He kept things that were important to him without always saying they were important." They stood in the kitchen together for a moment after that, and the moment had a quality that was not reconciliation, exactly, but something that made reconciliation possible, the acknowledgement of two people who have come through the same territory from different directions and arrived, with different maps, at roughly the same place. Clara said goodnight and gathered Sophia and drove home through the city with her daughter, asleep in the back seat, head against the window, the city lights moving across her face in slow, even intervals. What happened in the months after the process completed was not a transformation in the way that word is usually used. It was not a sudden change, not a rupture between a before and an after. It was an accumulation of specific, Deliberate decisions made by a woman who had been thinking carefully about what she wanted and why she wanted it for longer than the fortune itself had been confirmed. She moved. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the considered way she did everything. She found a house, a real one, with a yard sufficient for Sophia to have room, in a neighborhood near a school that was good without requiring justification. She paid for it outright, which produced a particular sensation she had not anticipated, the sensation of a transaction that ended rather than continuing indefinitely. She had been paying rent since she was 22, and the payment had always been a beginning, the first in a sequence that would continue next month and the month after. To pay something and have it finished was a different kind of experience, one that required adjustment. She kept the Strongbox. It sat in the corner of the new house's study, in a room she had set aside for the work she had decided to do. She had cleaned it, carefully, over several sessions, removing the decades of accumulated surface without disturbing the metal beneath. The symbol near the lid's edge was clearer now, its lines readable in a way they had not been when she first found it. She had not solved its full meaning, and was no longer certain the meaning needed to be solved. It was her grandfather's mark, placed there by someone who knew the box and its contents, and wanted to leave something of himself on the outside of what he was protecting. That was enough of an interpretation. Sophia had a room with yellow walls she had chosen herself, and a yard she had immediately begun populating with the particular projects of a 9-year-old presented with outdoor space for the first time. She had questions about the Strongbox, which she had watched move from the old apartment to the new house, with the ongoing interest of a child who understands that the box is important without knowing exactly why. Clara had told her, simply and honestly, that great-grandfather had kept something valuable in it for the family, and that now they had found it, and that it had changed things in good ways. Sophia had considered this and said, like a time capsule. Clara had said, something like that. Sophia had said, did he know we would find it? Clara had thought about this for a moment. She had thought about the letter, or about the years ahead, and the years that would need it. She had thought about the 2 names in the city, the contact maintained across decades. She had thought about the key lock designed to survive time, the secondary dial, the oilskin seal, the treated paper between the documents. She had thought about a man who had carried his silences with him all the way to the end and left instructions inside them. She had said, yes, I think he did. The work she had decided to do took the form of a small foundation, established in Arturo's name, focused on the specific gap she had spent her adult life managing. Not poverty in the abstract, not hardship as a category, but the particular situation of women in the circumstance she had been in, working, responsible, precise, managing the gap with all available tools, and still unable to close it. The gap between stability and its absence, that a single emergency, a single unexpected cost, could turn into a crisis with no available response. She had seen this from both sides, as someone who had lived it, and as someone who had spent years fielding calls from people who were living it. She understood its mechanics with the intimacy of direct experience. The foundation would not solve the systemic conditions that produced the gap. She was not naive about the scale of what she could do. But she could create, in the specific and targeted way her grandfather had created, a resource that was real and available and designed for the years that needed it. Vasquez helped structure it. Estrada consulted on the financial side. Marco sat on the advisory board, which he had agreed to immediately and without requiring reasons. Renata agreed to help with the initial outreach, which she was well suited for, in ways that Clara had always known, and that Renata had never been given a formal context to apply. The foundation's first year was small and careful, the way first years were supposed to be. It helped 43 families. The year after, it helped more, The work was not glamorous. It was administrative and precise, and required the sustained, unglamorous attention of someone who understood that the meaningful work of changing conditions was always less dramatic than the stories told about it. Clara gave it that attention willingly, without resentment, with the same quality of focus she had given to everything that had mattered. She was building something, not just the foundation. She was building a life that was shaped differently than the life she had been managing, a life that had room in it for the things she had not been able to give proper attention to when the attention was consumed by the arithmetic of barely enough. She was learning, slowly and sometimes awkwardly, what it meant to stand without the weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten she was carrying it. This was not simple. Wealth did not solve the problems that were not financial, and Clara had not thought it would. The tiredness was still there sometimes, in the evenings, a residue of the years before. The vigilance she had developed, the constant peripheral monitoring for the next thing that might go wrong, did not dissolve quickly. It receded gradually, the way learned responses recede when they are no longer required, not disappearing but becoming quieter, less insistent, willing to wait. She thought about her grandfather often in the new house, in the study with the Strongbox and the photograph of him at 30. She thought about the things she had not asked and would never know, the full shape of the life he had led before he became the quiet old man with the crowded house. She thought about the region he had come from, the period he had navigated, the decisions he had made in circumstances she could only partially reconstruct from documents and research and the letter written in his careful, deliberate hand. She thought about what it meant to keep something for a future you could not see, to protect something for people who did not yet exist in the form they would eventually take. There was a discipline in that kind of keeping that she had not fully appreciated until she began trying to practice it herself. The foundation was her version of it, not gold bars in a locked box, but resources structured to persist and function beyond the immediate moment, designed for the years ahead without knowing their particulars. He would have understood that, she thought. He was the kind of man who understood that form and function were inseparable, that the how of keeping something shaped, whether it would still be there when it was needed. Sophia was 10 now, then 11. She had opinions about the foundation's name, and had said once, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to modulate the observation, that great-grandfather's name was hard to say, and they should put his nickname on the logo instead. So this had made Clara laugh in the way she had laughed at Marco's kitchen table, the kind that fills a room because it belongs there. She had told Sophia, that evening, the full version of the story. Not the simplified version she had been given at 9, but the real version, the one with the notice on the kitchen table and the 2 jobs, and the calculation that never quite worked, and the family dismissing the box as worthless, and the locksmith who listened before he spoke, and the drive to the city with the duffel bag in the back seat and Estrada's hands folded on his desk, and the number on the page in Vasquez's office. She told it completely, including the parts that were hard, including the fear that she had not talked about to anyone while it was happening. Sophia listened with the full, an unperformed attention of a child who has been read to seriously since before she could read herself. When Clara finished, Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you saved us." Clara thought about this. She said, "Your great-grandfather saved us. I just paid attention." Sophia thought about this in turn. She said, "But that's the same thing. Paying attention is how you save things." Clara looked at her daughter, 10 years old, sitting on the floor of the study in the house with the yellow bedroom in the yard, in front of the Strongbox that had sat in her grandfather's back room for 40 years, beneath a length of canvas, while the family moved around it and decided it was worthless. She looked at her and thought about Arturo in his photograph, making his peace with what was happening. She thought about the letter. She thought about the years ahead. She said, Yes, that's exactly right. There is a particular quality to the silence of things that have been understood. It is different from the silence of things that are merely old, or merely kept, or merely overlooked. It is a silence that has been arrived at rather than simply accumulated, a quiet that comes after rather than before. The strongbox in the corner of the study held that kind of silence now. Not the silence of concealment, the silence of completion. Everything Arturo had placed inside it had been what he intended it to be. The certifications had held. The documentation had held. The mechanisms designed to protect and preserve the contents across decades had done precisely what they were built to do. He had built them well because he had understood that the future was not a certainty, but a probability, and that what you left for it needed to be constructed with enough care to survive the distance. He had survived the distance. What he had left had survived. And the person he had left it for, the granddaughter who paid attention to things others walked past, had been in exactly the condition he had described when he wrote the letter, in the years that needed it, in the place where the kept thing could become the better thing his silence had been waiting to become. There was nothing miraculous in this. That was what struck Clara most clearly when she thought about it, in the months and years after everything had resolved. Nothing miraculous had happened. A man had been careful over a long time. A woman had paid attention in a difficult moment. A locked box had been opened by someone who understood that the right approach was patience rather than force. The pieces had fit together not because of luck, but because they had been shaped to fit, by a grandfather who planned ahead, and a granddaughter who looked closely, and a locksmith who listened, and a lawyer who was thorough, and a process that took the time it needed to take. This was the story. Not a story of sudden fortune or magical discovery. A story of the specific, accumulated consequence of care, of things kept long enough to matter, of attention given to what others preferred not to value, of the years ahead meeting the preparation made for them and finding it sufficient. Clara sat in the study sometimes in the evenings, after Sophia was in bed, with the lamp on and the strongbox in its corner and the photograph of her grandfather on the shelf. She sat with the particular quality of presence that comes to people who have stopped managing what they cannot change and begun building what they can. Not contentment in the passive sense, something more active. The specific satisfaction of someone who has looked at the shape of her life and found it, for the first time in a long time, to be the shape she intended. The city outside was the same city it had always been. The world outside was the same world, with the same gaps in it, the same arithmetic that did not work for too many people, the same overlooked boxes in the back rooms of lives that other people did not think worth examining. She knew this, and she was not under any illusion that what had happened to her had solved anything beyond her own situation and the situations of the people the foundation had reached. But she had learned something from her grandfather that went beyond the specific fortune he had left her. She had learned that care taken in the present was not lost, that what was built with attention and protected with patience did not simply disappear because circumstances made it necessary to keep it quiet, that the years ahead were real and would arrive and would need what had been set aside for them, and that the woman or man or child who found themselves in those years would be better served by what had been kept than by what had been thrown away out of impatience or incuriosity or the ordinary failure of attention. She had learned this from a box in a corner that everyone else had decided was worthless. She intended to remember it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.